Imagine standing in the middle of the Texas plains, in the summer heat, staring out at row after row after row of American battle tanks. Thousands of them. Machines that had rolled off assembly lines built to fight Hitler, built to punch through the hedgerows of Normandy and the deserts of North Africa. And now here they sat, silent, rusting, waiting for men with cutting torches to walk down the line and turn them into scrap. You have to ask yourself, how does a nation build the most powerful armored force on Earth, and then, within a few short years, start feeding that same force into the furnace? What happened to America's tanks after World War II ended? Why did so many of them end up right here, in Texas, destined not for museums or monuments, but for the scrapyard? And why does almost nobody talk about it? By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how the most advanced armored arsenal in human history nearly vanished from the record books entirely. And the story starts not on a battlefield, but in a quiet accounting office, where a single number was about to change everything. To understand why so many tanks ended up on the chopping block, you have to go back to what America built in the first place. Before the war, the United States Army had barely a few hundred operational tanks. By 1945, American factories had produced tens of thousands of them. The M4 Sherman became the backbone of the Allied armored effort, rolling off production lines at facilities like the Detroit Tank Arsenal and the Fisher Body plants at a pace that stunned even the men running the factories. Entire cities restructured their economies around tank production. Steel that once framed skyscrapers now framed hulls. Assembly workers who had never touched a rifle were welding armor plate 12 hours a day. This wasn't just industrial output, it was a demonstration to the entire world of what American manufacturing could achieve under pressure. Texas played its own critical role in this build-up. Camp Hood, established in central Texas in 1942, became the training ground for the Army's Tank Destroyer Force, a specialized branch built specifically to hunt and kill enemy armor. Hundreds of thousands of acres of Texas ranch land were converted into proving grounds, gunnery ranges, and maneuver fields. Soldiers learned to stalk German panzers using American-built tank destroyers, vehicles engineered from the same industrial base that was cranking out Shermans by the thousand. By 1944, the United States possessed the single largest mechanized armored force the world had ever seen. And then, within 12 months, the war that justified all of it would be over. Nobody in Washington had a real plan for what came next. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. 3 months later, Japan followed. And almost overnight, the machine that had been running at full capacity for 4 straight years slammed to a halt. Factories that had been building tanks around the clock suddenly had no orders to fill. Soldiers by the millions began pouring back across the Atlantic and the Pacific, heading home to civilian life, leaving behind entire depots full of equipment that no one now needed. The scale of the surplus was almost impossible to comprehend. Estimates of the total value of leftover military property after the war ranged as high as $150 billion. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, artillery, ammunition, spare parts, uniforms, mess kits, entire prefabricated buildings, all of it now sitting unused. Military bases that had been humming with wartime urgency became ghost towns of idle machinery. Depots in Europe, in the Pacific, and across the American heartland were suddenly overflowing with hardware nobody had budgeted to store, maintain, or transport home. And this created an immediate and brutal problem: storage. A tank does not sit quietly and wait. Left outdoors, exposed to weather, a Sherman's engine seizes, its rubber track pads rot, its electrical systems corrode. Maintaining tens of thousands of idle tanks in usable condition would have required an army of mechanics the government no longer had funding to pay, and storing them indoors, in climate-controlled depots, at that scale, was simply not physically possible. The government now faced a choice nobody wanted to make. Do you spend enormous sums keeping obsolete wartime hardware in fighting condition, on the chance it might be needed again? Or do you let it go? The peace that America had fought so hard to win was creating a logistical nightmare almost as complicated as the war itself. But that wasn't the strangest part. What happened next would turn battlefield heroes into scrap metal, and nobody had the stomach to admit it out loud. In March of 1946, the federal government stood up an agency to deal with exactly this problem: the War Assets Administration. Its job was staggering in scope: take every piece of leftover military property in the country and figure out what to do with it. Sell it, donate it, store it, or destroy it. The debates inside Washington were fierce. Military planners argued that keeping large stockpiles of tanks in reserve made strategic sense in case tensions with the Soviet Union escalated into another war. Fiscal conservatives in Congress argued the opposite, that maintaining unused armor was a staggering waste of taxpayer money, with no clear enemy left to fight. Veterans groups pushed for surplus vehicles and equipment to be made available to returning soldiers at discount prices to help them rebuild civilian lives. Industrial lobbyists, meanwhile, saw an opportunity. Scrapped tanks meant raw steel, and raw steel meant cheap material for a booming post-war manufacturing economy that desperately needed it. Public opinion was mixed and often contradictory. Newspapers ran stories celebrating the arsenal of democracy, while quietly, on inside pages, reporting on mountains of unsold jeeps and tanks rusting in fields from California to Georgia. The War Assets Administration ultimately chose a hybrid solution. Some tanks were kept in reserve fleets, mothballed against a future conflict nobody could yet name. Some were sold at steep discounts to Allied nations rebuilding their own militaries. Some were converted for civilian use, their turrets removed, their hulls repurposed as construction equipment or agricultural machinery, and a significant number, especially aging or mechanically worn Shermans that had already seen hard combat use, were designated for one final purpose: scrap. The machines that had crossed the beaches of Normandy were about to be melted back down into raw steel. The question was no longer whether tanks would be scrapped. It was where and how many, and who would be left to watch it happen. The men making these calls weren't villains. They were bureaucrats and generals and accountants trying to solve an unprecedented problem with no real precedent to draw on. America had never before demobilized an armored force of this size, and there was no manual for how to do it responsibly. Some officers pushed hard for a national register of historically significant vehicles, tanks that had led famous assaults, tanks tied to decorated units, arguing that at least a token number should be preserved for posterity rather than melted down alongside the rest. Those proposals mostly went nowhere. There was no budget line for sentiment. Every vehicle preserved was a vehicle that cost money to store, and money was the one thing nobody in Washington wanted to spend on machines the country no longer needed to fight a war that was already won. Meanwhile, in state capitals and county courthouses, local officials lobbied for their share of the surplus. Some wanted trucks for road crews, some wanted spare parts for volunteer fire departments. Almost nobody, at any level of government, was lobbying to keep old, worn-out Sherman tanks in working order. They were seen not as historical treasures, but as depreciated assets, expensive, obsolete, and taking up space that could be put to better civilian use. This is where the story gets its sharpest edges, because the disposal of America's tank force didn't happen in one dramatic event. It happened in hundreds of quiet, scattered operations across the country, and Texas sat right at the center of it. Camp Hood, the very training ground that had turned green recruits into tank destroyer crews during the war, saw its wartime population collapse almost overnight. By the end of the war, troop strength at the post had fallen to a fraction of its wartime peak, and with fewer soldiers came fewer reasons to maintain the enormous stockpiles of armored vehicles that had once filled its ranges. Vehicles that had been used purely for training, worn out from years of gunnery practice, obstacle courses, and maneuver drills, were exactly the kind of equipment the War Assets Administration didn't want to spend money preserving. Scrap dealers across Texas and the broader Southwest bid on surplus contracts, buying decommissioned armor by the pound rather than by the unit. Cutting crews would move down long rows of parked vehicles, torches in hand, stripping away anything of value, copper wiring, aluminum components, brass fittings, before reducing the steel hulls themselves into manageable pieces for the smelters. Photographs from the era, taken at scrapyards across the country, show the same haunting scene repeated again and again. Turrets stacked like children's toys, hulls split open, tracks unspooled across the dirt like dead snakes. It wasn't only tanks. Aircraft faced an even larger reckoning. Tens of thousands of surplus planes were scrapped at facilities like Kingman, Arizona, where thousands of bombers alone were melted down within a single year of the war's end. Tanks followed a similar, if less centralized, path. Not every scrapped tank in the country passed through Texas. But Texas, with its vast open land, its wartime tank destroyer heritage, and its dense concentration of surplus depots, became one of the country's most significant staging grounds for the process. The very ground that had trained America's tank killers became one of the places where America's own tanks met their end. And the men doing the cutting had no idea that, decades later, people around the world would be desperately searching for the very machines they were destroying. The work itself was grueling and unglamorous. Cutting crews worked in brutal Texas heat, torches hissing against inch-thick armor plate that had been engineered specifically to resist exactly this kind of destruction. A single Sherman hull could take a crew the better part of a day to fully break down, depending on how much of the internal machinery needed to be salvaged first. Engines were pulled and set aside, since a functioning Continental Radial or Ford GAA engine had real resale value on the civilian market, useful for anything from irrigation pumps to marine applications. Transmissions, final drives, and any remaining rubber components were stripped for their materials. What was left, the bare steel hull and turret, was cut into sections small enough to fit into rail cars bound for regional steel mills, where it would be melted down and poured into new ingots, destined to become anything from automobile frames to construction rebar. In a strange way, pieces of the tanks that helped liberate Europe may well have ended up as steel beams in post-war American schools, hospitals, and highway overpasses. The war machine literally rebuilt into the architecture of ordinary civilian life. Because here's the twist almost nobody expects. Some of those scrapped tanks didn't actually disappear. In the years following the war, a strange, quiet market emerged around the world for exactly this kind of surplus armor. Newly formed nations, cash-strapped and desperate for any kind of military hardware, sent buyers combing through junkyards in Europe, in the Philippines, and yes, in the United States, looking for Sherman tanks that scrap dealers hadn't yet gotten around to melting. In 1948, agents working on behalf of the newly declared State of Israel searched junkyards as far away as Italy and the Philippines, quietly acquiring dozens of derelict Sherman hulls, vehicles considered worthless scrap by the nations that had once owned them, and smuggling them home disguised as tractors and agricultural equipment. Those same worthless tanks were rebuilt, rearmed, and would go on to fight in multiple Arab-Israeli conflicts over the following decades. It's a staggering irony. Hardware one country was actively destroying for its raw material value became, in the hands of another nation, a founding piece of an entire armored corps. Other Shermans found their way to France, to India, and elsewhere, sold as military surplus rather than scrapped outright, refitted with new guns and new engines, serving on for another 20, 30, even 40 years after the guns of World War II had gone silent. Meanwhile, back in the United States, private collectors and small museums occasionally managed to pull individual tanks out of the disposal pipeline before they reached the torches, saving a handful of machines almost by accident, simply because someone with enough money and enough interest showed up at the right scrapyard on the right day. The rest were not so lucky. For every tank that escaped into a museum or a foreign army, dozens more were reduced to nothing more than a stack of unmarked steel plate, headed for a furnace, with no name, no unit history, and no one left to remember which crew had once called it home. There are stories buried in this era that most people have never heard. Some surplus tank hulls, stripped of their turrets and engines, were repurposed as flood barriers along riverbanks, their heavy armor plate reused as makeshift levees in low-lying farm country. Others became targets, quite literally, used by artillery units for live fire practice for years after the war, meaning some of the tanks that survived the fighting in Europe were eventually destroyed not in combat, but in training exercises back home. In at least a few documented cases, scrap dealers who purchased tanks by weight discovered, upon cutting them open, forgotten personal items left behind by crews, photographs, letters, even unit insignia. Small human traces of the men who had once ridden inside these machines into combat, discarded along with the steel. Some tank engines, remarkably robust and simple by design, were pulled before scrapping and repurposed into irrigation pumps and generators on rural farms across the Southwest, quietly powering American agriculture for years, using engineering originally designed to power war. Government paperwork from the period, some of it only declassified decades later, reveals just how disorganized the whole process really was. Surplus inventories that didn't match what was actually sitting in the yards, vehicles double-counted or simply lost in the bureaucracy, entire lots of equipment that was sold, resold, and sold again before anyone tracked where they actually ended up. And perhaps strangest of all, a small number of experimental or prototype armored vehicles, never intended for mass production, ended up in these same disposal yards by simple bureaucratic accident, and were scrapped alongside standard Shermans, destroying pieces of engineering history that today would be considered priceless. Local Texas newspapers from the period occasionally ran small, almost throwaway items about the scrapping operations. A few paragraphs buried near the classifieds, noting that another lot of obsolete army vehicles had gone up for bid, with no sense at all that they were documenting the quiet dismantling of the most powerful armored force the world had ever assembled. Nobody thought to interview the cutting crews, nobody thought to photograph the tanks before the torches went to work, beyond a handful of official inventory photos, meant purely for bureaucratic record-keeping. It's one of the strange truths of this whole era, an event this massive in scale, involving so much of what had defined American power just months earlier, left behind almost no cultural memory at all, because at the time, nobody involved thought there was anything worth remembering. The legacy of this disposal era still shapes how the world thinks about military equipment today. The post-war drawdown taught the Pentagon a hard lesson about the true cost of victory, that winning a war creates a second, quieter war against your own logistics, one fought with paperwork and cutting torches instead of guns. It's a lesson that shaped how the United States handled surplus equipment after Korea, after Vietnam, and after every conflict since, always with an eye toward avoiding the chaotic, ad hoc disposal of 1945 and 1946. It also permanently altered the global map of military power. Today, surviving Sherman tanks are treasured as rare historical artifacts, restored and displayed in museums across the country, drawing crowds who have no idea how close these specific machines came to being cut into scrap alongside thousands of their sisters. Some of the very ranges around what is now Fort Hood still bear the scars of this era in the ground itself. Spent shell casings, buried vehicle parts, and scrap fragments occasionally surfacing even now, more than 75 years later. The story of America's post-war tank disposal is, in the end, a story about how quickly the tools of victory can become an afterthought, and how easily history can be melted down before anyone thinks to save it. So the next time you see a Sherman tank sitting proudly in a museum, polished and roped off behind velvet stanchions, remember what it survived to get there. It didn't just survive Normandy, or the Ardennes, or the deserts of North Africa. It survived something far less dramatic and far more final, a decision made in a Washington office, an auction to the highest scrap bidder, a cutting crew working through a Texas afternoon with no idea they were holding history in their hands. For every tank that made it into a museum, there were dozens that didn't, reduced to steel plate and forgotten paperwork, their stories erased along with their serial numbers. What does it say about how we treat the tools of our greatest victories once we no longer need them? If this story surprised you, you're not alone. Almost nobody knows this chapter of the war ever happened. Let me know in the comments which part shocked you the most, and if you want to see the next hidden story from America's wartime past, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. Because some of the biggest secrets of World War II were never buried on a battlefield at all. They were buried in a scrapyard,